He played a simple violin note, and his life changed forever. He was always just an ordinary retired musician, spending his days in quiet solitude after his wife's passing. His plan to retreat to Pennsylvania Amish country seemed perfect. No distractions, no music to remind him of Clara. But one day something happened that turned everything upside down. At first it seemed like a coincidence. Just the faint sound of violin music drifting across the cornfields before dawn, coming from an Amish barn where no instruments should exist. But then, things started to get even stranger. Seconds felt like an eternity. His heart was pounding. And then at that very moment when it seemed like there was no turning back, he discovered young Eli Zook, an Amish boy with an extraordinary gift, secretly crafting violins in his father's barn with a talent that defied explanation. But the most unbelievable part happened after that. It was so incredible that if someone had told him before, he never would have believed it. This chance encounter would not only heal his own grief, but transform an entire community's relationship with music, bridging two worlds through the universal language of melody and craftsmanship. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the gentle embrace of a Pennsylvania morning, where mist clings to cornfields like whispered prayers, a single violin song pierces the dawn. Who dares to challenge the silence of these sacred hours, when even the birds haven't yet stirred from their slumber? The answer lies in the hands of young Eli Zook, whose bow draws across strings with the delicacy of morning dew falling from leaves. 17-year-old Eli stands in the shadow of his family's weathered barn, his fingers dancing across the violin's neck with a grace that betrays his Amish upbringing. Each note floats across the farmland like a secret message, carrying with it dreams larger than the simple life he's meant to lead. The melody, a haunting arrangement of amazing grace, weaves through the morning air with such raw emotion that even the roosters pause their morning calls to listen. Sir Anthony Hopkins, watching from the edge of his neighboring property, recognizes the familiar strains of the hymn, the same piece his beloved Clara used to play on their grand piano before illness claimed her. His weathered hands grip the fence post as he listens, remembering how Clara would say music was God's way of reminding us that beauty exists even in the darkest moments. The boy's playing carries the same spirit that Clara's did, untamed and pure. Sarah Zook moves silently through the kitchen of their farmhouse, her heart heavy with the weight of her brother's forbidden passion. At 23, she understands better than most the price of defying their father's strict adherence to tradition. Through the window, she catches glimpses of Eli's silhouette, his arm moving in perfect rhythm as he plays. Her fingers unconsciously tap against her apron, matching the tempo of his song. But it's the approaching figure of Ezekiel Zook that threatens to shatter this peaceful morning tableau. His heavy boots crush the dewy grass beneath them, each step carrying the weight of generations of tradition. In his right hand, an axe swings with methodical precision matching his stride. The tool usually reserved for chopping wood now serves as a symbol of something far more ominous. Jacob Miller, making his early morning deliveries to the English stores in town, slows his truck as he passes the Zook farm. The music reaches him even through closed windows, and he recognizes the talent that could easily grace any concert hall in Lancaster County. His thoughts drift to the violin workshop waiting in his store, where an unfinished instrument bears the secret markings of Eli's craftsmanship. The morning light strengthens, casting long shadows across the farmland as Eli reaches the crescendo of his piece. His eyes remain closed, lost in the music that flows through him like life itself. He doesn't see his father's approach, doesn't notice how Ezekiel's knuckles whiten around the axe handle with each step. The violin sings louder, higher, reaching for notes that seem to touch heaven itself. Sir Anthony takes an involuntary step forward, his body tensing as he watches the scene unfold. The memory of Clara's voice echoes in his mind, reminding him of her last words about music being worth fighting for. His eyes meet Sarah's through the kitchen window, and a silent understanding passes between them. How many mornings have they witnessed this dance between father and son, tradition and passion, duty and dreams? The violin's song continues to soar across the morning landscape, carrying with it the weight of choices yet to be made and paths yet to be chosen. In this moment, suspended between night and day, between what is and what could be, a young man plays his heart out while his world stands on the precipice of change. What will break first? The morning silence, or the delicate balance that holds this small community together? As the sun finally crests the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, time seems to slow. The last note hangs in the air like a question waiting to be answered, while footsteps draw ever closer to where Eli stands. What price must be paid for following one's heart in a world bound by tradition? And who will stand beside him when the moment of truth arrives? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Lancaster County farmland as Sir Anthony Hopkins's vintage Volvo crawled along the dusty road. Each turn of the wheels brought him closer to what his agent had promised would be blessed solitude, though the tight grip of grief around his heart made him question if any place could truly offer peace. Through the windshield, Anthony observed the methodical movements of Amish farmers in their fields, their steady pace a stark contrast to the frenetic London symphony halls he'd left behind. Clara would have appreciated the simplicity here, he thought, remembering how she'd always sought beauty in quiet moments. But 3 years after her passing, even memories of her brought both comfort and pain in equal measure. The farmhouse appeared around the bend, its weathered white boards and green shutters standing sentinel against the morning sky. A young woman in traditional Amish dress, Eli Zook, according to his arrangements, stood waiting by the fence. Her practical stance and watchful eyes reminded Anthony of the stage managers he'd worked with, always anticipating the next movement before it occurred. As Anthony's car came to a stop, the sound of violin music drifted across the property so faint he almost believed he'd imagined it. The notes carried a raw talent that made his musician's ears prick up, but they cut off abruptly. In their wake, he heard the sharp crack of wood splitting and a man's stern voice rising in Pennsylvania Dutch. Sarah approached his car with measured steps, her expression carefully neutral. "Welcome to our farm, Mr. Hopkins," she said, her English clear but touched with the distinct cadence of her community. "I trust you found your way without trouble?" Before Anthony could respond, heavy footsteps approached from the barn. Ezekiel Zook emerged, his beard untrimmed and his eyes hard beneath the brim of his hat. The man carried himself with the rigid authority of someone unused to having his decisions questioned, and Anthony recognized the type immediately from countless encounters with stubborn orchestra directors. "This is not a good time," Ezekiel stated flatly, positioning himself between Sarah and their visitor. "Perhaps you should return another day." Sarah's hands clasped together, a subtle tell of tension. "Dad, we discussed this. Mr. Hopkins has rented the guest house for the season. The bishop approved the arrangement." The mention of the bishop seemed to check whatever protest Ezekiel had prepared, but his disapproval remained evident in the gore set of his shoulders. Anthony found himself wondering about the violin music he'd heard, and about the sharp way it had ended. What discord lay beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful farm? From the corner of his eye, Anthony caught movement. Near the barn, a young man slipping away, something long and thin wrapped carefully in cloth tucked beneath his arm. The boy's quick departure and furtive glances sparked Anthony's curiosity, reminding him of conservatory students hiding their practice sessions from demanding instructors. "The guest house is prepared," Sarah continued, smoothly filling the awkward silence. "Though you should know that our ways are plain. There is no electricity, but we've stocked it with lanterns and everything else you'll need." Anthony nodded, grateful for her diplomatic intervention. "I've conducted by candlelight in power outages. Sometimes the best music comes when we strip away all the modern trappings." He directed this last comment toward Ezekiel, testing the waters, but the older man's expression remained impassive. As Sarah led him toward the small house set apart from the main farmhouse, Anthony became aware of eyes watching from various vantage points, faces in windows, figures pausing in their work. His arrival was clearly an event of interest in this close-knit community. But it was the violin music that continued to occupy his thoughts. Who had been playing? And why had they stopped so abruptly? The guest house stood as a testament to Amish craftsmanship, its simple lines belying the skill evident in every joint and angle. Sarah showed him inside, explaining the basics of the pump for water and where to find extra kerosene for the lamps. But Anthony's attention caught on something else. A small mark carved into the wooden doorframe, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. To most, it might have appeared to be a simple imperfection in the wood, but to Anthony's trained eye it was unmistakably a musical notation symbol. What secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward community? And how did they connect to the violin music that had greeted his arrival? Anthony realized that his search for solitude might lead him instead to something far more intriguing, a mystery composed in the language he knew best: music. The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves across the Lancaster County farmland. In the pre-dawn hours, when darkness still cloaked the Zook family farm, a haunting melody drifted through the air. Anthony Hopkins, lying awake in his rented cottage, initially mistook the sound for his imagination, a remnant of Clara's piano pieces that often visited him in dreams. But this was different. The notes, though distant, held a raw, untutored beauty that spoke of natural talent rather than formal training. Who would be playing music at this hour, especially on an Amish farm where such activities were generally discouraged? The question pulled Anthony from his bed, drawing him toward the window. The sound seemed to emanate from the weathered barn, its silhouette barely visible in the gathering light. The melody reminded him of the folk tunes Clara used to adapt for her classical compositions, but with an ethereal quality that made his breath catch. As Anthony listened more intently, he recognized the instrument, a violin, though not one of professional quality. The bowstrokes betrayed both passion and inexperience, creating a unique tension between natural gift and technical limitation. It stirred memories of his early days teaching music, when raw talent would shine through despite technical imperfections. Could this be why Jacob Miller had directed him to this particular farm? The music stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of shuffling and a quickly closed door. Anthony caught a glimpse of a figure, tall and lean, slipping from the barn into the shadows. The size and movement suggested young Eli Zook, though Anthony couldn't be certain in the dim light. The possibility intrigued him, especially given Ezekiel's stern demeanor regarding anything that deviated from traditional Amish ways. Later that morning, as Anthony walked the property's perimeter, he observed Sarah Zook hanging laundry while humming the same melody he'd heard before dawn. Their eyes met briefly, and something in her expression, a mixture of protective concern and silent understanding, confirmed his suspicions about the mysterious violinist. Sarah's quick glance toward the barn, followed by a subtle shake of her head when her father approached, spoke volumes about the complex dynamics at play. Ezekiel's presence seemed to cast a shadow over the farm's daily activities. His watchful eyes followed Anthony's movements with barely concealed suspicion, particularly when Anthony lingered near the barn. The tension between father and children became apparent in small moments. Eli's downcast eyes during morning prayers, Sarah's careful positioning between her father and brother during meals, the way conversations died when Ezekiel entered a room. Anthony recognized the patterns from his years of teaching. Talented students constrained by circumstances beyond their control, but this situation demanded delicacy. One wrong move could shatter the fragile ecosystem of the Zook family and destroy the very thing he hoped to nurture. The memory of Clara's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that sometimes the greatest acts of teaching required patience rather than instruction. During the following days, Anthony began leaving his cottage door open while playing recordings of classical violin pieces, soft enough to seem casual, yet clear enough to carry across the yard. He noticed Eli's work patterns shifting, bringing him closer to the cottage during these musical interludes. The boy's attempts at nonchalance couldn't hide his interest, especially when Anthony played pieces that incorporated folk elements similar to the melody from the barn. Sarah's role became increasingly apparent as she orchestrated subtle opportunities for Eli to linger near the cottage. She would send him on errands that required passing Anthony's door or ask him to help with tasks in that section of the property. Her orchestration showed both intelligence and deep love for her brother, though her careful glances toward the main house revealed the weight of her secret support. The mystery of the violin itself remained. Anthony had noticed Jacob Miller's wagon making regular deliveries to the farm, though the visits seemed brief and businesslike. Was there a connection between these deliveries and the instrument he'd heard? The quality of tone suggested a student, violin, yet even these would be difficult to obtain within the constraints of Amish life. As autumn deepened, the pre-dawn concerts became more frequent, each session showing subtle improvements in technique. Anthony found himself awakening before each performance, drawn to the window by both professional interest and growing personal investment in this hidden talent. The music carried echoes of something familiar, not just in melody, but in the spirit behind the playing. It reminded him of Clara's descriptions of her early learning, practicing in secret because her family believed music was frivolous. What would it take to bridge the gap between Ezekiel's rigid adherence to tradition and his son's obvious musical gift? The answer lay somewhere in the complex web of family relationships, community expectations, and personal dreams that Anthony was only beginning to understand. As he listened to another morning's hidden performance, he realized that his role here might be more than just finding solitude. It might be about helping another soul find its voice. Sarah's footsteps barely whispered against the worn wooden steps as she led Anthony toward the barn's upper level. The late afternoon sun filtered through weathered boards, casting zebra-striped shadows across their path. Anthony's mind still echoed with the haunting violin notes he'd heard earlier, music that shouldn't exist in this simple Amish setting. Eli found this space last summer, Sarah explained in hushed tones, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern. Father rarely comes up here anymore, not since Mother's passing. She paused at a narrow doorway, her hand resting on the rough-hewn frame. What I'm about to show you, it must remain between us. Behind the door lay a revelation that made Anthony's breath catch. Scattered across makeshift workbenches were the unmistakable tools of a violin maker, carefully carved scrolls, partially assembled bodies and delicate strips of wood waiting to be shaped. The space carried the sweet scent of fresh-cut maple and spruce, mingled with the earthy aroma of varnish. How long has he been doing this? Anthony asked, running his fingers along a nearly completed violin body. The craftsmanship showed remarkable promise, though the telltale signs of a learning hand were evident in slight imperfections. Sarah moved to a small window, her silhouette framed against the dying light. It started with simple repairs. Jacob Miller, you know him from town, would bring broken instruments. Eli watched, learned. She turned back to Anthony, her eyes reflecting both worry and hope. But Father cannot know. Music, it's too painful. For him, since Uncle Samuel left the community. Anthony examined the tools, many of them handmade adaptations of conventional equipment. Eli's ingenuity spoke volumes about his dedication. These aren't just hobby pieces, he observed, picking up a partially carved scroll. He's studying technique, developing his own style. The conversation shifted as Sarah revealed more about their family's complicated relationship with music. Ezekiel's brother Samuel had chosen to leave the Amish life to pursue a musical career, creating a wound that had never properly healed. Father sees music as the thing that broke our family, Sarah explained. But for Eli, it's different. It's like breathing. Anthony's thoughts drifted to Clara, remembering how she would say that music wasn't just about sound. It was about giving voice to the soul's deepest expressions. Here, in this hidden loft, Eli had created more than just a workshop. He'd built a sanctuary where his own soul could speak. Jacob's been teaching him in secret, Sarah continued, straightening some tools on the workbench. But Eli needs more. He has questions that Jacob can't answer, techniques he's struggling to master. Her eyes met Anthony's with quiet intensity. When I heard you were moving here, when I learned about your background, the unspoken request hung in the air between them. Anthony understood the delicate balance they were discussing, not just between tradition and progress, but between a father's pain and a son's calling. The situation reminded him of Clara's favorite quote about music being the bridge between earth and heaven. Sarah moved toward a small chest tucked beneath one of the workbenches. "There's something else you should see," she said, carefully lifting the lid. Inside lay several completed violins, each one showing progression in skill and refinement. But it was the notebook beside them that caught Anthony's attention. Pages, filled with technical drawings, measurements, and careful observations about tone and resonance. "He's been teaching himself physics," Sarah explained, a hint of amazement in her voice. "Studying how sound works, how different woods affect the tone. He sneaks books from the library in town, copies what he needs to know." Anthony felt a familiar stirring in his heart, the same feeling he'd had years ago when mentoring young musicians at the conservatory. But this situation required more than just technical guidance. It needed careful navigation through family dynamics and cultural traditions. The fading daylight warned of evening's approach, and Sarah began gathering herself to leave. "Father, will be looking for me soon," she said, moving toward the door. "But now you understand why I needed you to see this. Eli has a gift, Mr. Hopkins. And sometimes gifts need protecting, nurturing, even when they grow in unexpected places." As they descended from the loft, Anthony's mind was already forming plans, remembering teaching methods that might work within the constraints of Eli's situation. But more importantly, he was beginning to understand the complex web of relationships and emotions surrounding this hidden talent. How could he help Eli develop his gift while respecting the delicate balance of family loyalty and personal calling? The haunting melody of a violin drifted through the evening air, carrying with it memories that Anthony had tucked away years ago. As he sat in his study, surrounded by photographs and remnants of a life shared with Clara, the music from Eli's hidden workshop transported him to another time. How could a young Amish boy's playing echo so precisely the emotional depth that Clara once drew from her piano? The connection between music and memory proved stronger than Anthony anticipated. Each note Eli crafted reminded him of Clara's delicate touch on the piano keys, the way she would close her eyes and sway slightly when particularly moved by a passage. The boy possessed that same innate understanding of music's power to transcend the ordinary, to speak directly to the soul. Through the thin walls of his home, Anthony could distinguish Eli practicing one of Bach's partitas, the same piece Clara had often played in her own arrangements. The parallel struck him with such force that he found himself reaching for Clara's old music sheets, their edges worn from years of use. Her handwritten notes in the margins revealed her thought process, her musical journey, so similar to what he now witnessed in Eli's development. Sarah's revelation of Eli's secret workshop had opened more than just a physical space. It had unlocked a chamber of Anthony's heart he thought permanently sealed. The violin maker in him recognized Eli's raw talent for crafting instruments, but the widower in him heard Clara's spirit in every sound the boy produced. What would Clara have thought of this unlikely student? How would she have guided this young prodigy? The music suddenly shifted to something unfamiliar, an original composition, perhaps. Anthony leaned forward in his chair, straining to catch every nuance. Eli was writing his own story through music, just as Clara had done. The melody carried hints of traditional Amish hymns, woven seamlessly with classical structures, creating something entirely new. This fusion of worlds reflected Anthony's own journey with the Zook family, the unexpected bridges being built between their communities. Memories of Clara began to blur with the present moment. He recalled her words about music being a universal language, one that could traverse any barrier of culture or belief. Had she somehow known that her philosophy would prove so vital years later? The thought of Clara's influence reaching beyond her time to touch Eli's life filled Anthony with a profound sense of purpose. The relationship between mentor and student had evolved into something deeper, something that echoed Anthony's love for Clara and her dedication to nurturing young talent. Through Eli, he found himself sharing not just technical knowledge about violin crafting, but the very essence of what made music transformative. Each lesson became an opportunity to honor Clara's memory while helping Eli forge his own path. Sarah's role in this musical awakening hadn't escaped Anthony's notice. Her quiet support of her brother's passion, despite their father's opposition, reminded him of Clara's own steadfast nature. How many times had Clara stood firm in her beliefs about music's importance, even when faced with skepticism? Sarah possessed that same quiet strength, protecting Eli's dream while navigating the complex waters of their Amish community's expectations. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Anthony's reverie. The violin music ceased and reality began to seep back in. Yet the presence of Clara's spirit lingered, as if she had been there all along, guiding this unlikely partnership between an English violin maker and an Amish boy with extraordinary gifts. What other surprises lay ahead in this unfolding story? Anthony glanced at the clock, realizing hours had passed while he sat lost in memory and music. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Ezekiel's disapproval, the community's watchful eyes, the delicate balance between tradition and progress. But tonight, in the aftermath of Eli's playing, Anthony felt Clara's presence more strongly than ever, affirming the path he had chosen to mentor this gifted young man. The question remained: how would Clara's influence continue to shape the events unfolding between these two worlds? As Anthony prepared for sleep, Eli's music still echoing in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if Clara had somehow orchestrated this entire situation, bringing together unlikely allies in pursuit of something greater than themselves. What other echoes of her wisdom would emerge as this journey continued? The autumn morning carried the scent of freshly cut wood through Jacob Miller's workshop, where generations of violins had taken shape beneath skilled hands. His weathered fingers traced the outline of an unfinished instrument, its curves reminiscent of the many pieces that had passed through this sacred space. But none had captured his attention quite like the work of young Eli Zook. Who would have thought that an Amish boy, working by candlelight in a barn, could possess such innate understanding of violin craftsmanship? Jacob had first noticed Eli's potential during a chance encounter at the local lumber yard, where the boy's eyes had lingered too long on a piece of aged maple. Those weren't the eyes of someone merely admiring wood. They were the eyes of a craftsman seeing the music within. The bell above his shop door chimed, pulling Jacob from his reverie. Sir Anthony Hopkins stepped inside, his presence filling the modest space with an air of quiet authority. "Jacob?" He nodded, removing his hat. "I trust you received my message about young Eli?" The woodworker's eyes crinkled with knowing appreciation. "I've been expecting this conversation for some time, Anthony. That boy has been leaving traces of his work throughout the community, though few know where to look." Jacob moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop, retrieving a carefully wrapped package. As he unwrapped the brown paper, a violin emerged, crude in its finishing, but bearing the unmistakable hallmarks of raw talent. "This arrived on my doorstep 6 months ago, left anonymously in the dead of night. But I knew. The way the scroll was carved, the precise measurements of the sound holes, they spoke of someone who understands the soul of the instrument." Anthony lifted the violin, studying its imperfect beauty. How many nights had Eli spent crafting this piece, hidden from his father's disapproving eyes? The thought stirred memories of Clara, of her own secret piano practices in her youth defying her parents' wishes. "There's more," Jacob continued, pulling out a worn leather journal. "I've been keeping notes on the instruments I've found. 3, others each better than the last, discovered in various places. The Miller barn behind the general store, even one in the hollow of an old oak tree near the creek. He's been practicing his craft wherever he can find space and time." The revelation painted a picture of dedication that touched Anthony deeply. Here was a young man who, despite every obstacle his community placed before him, found ways to pursue his passion. It reminded him of Clara's words about the persistence of true calling, how it finds its way out like water seeking the sea. Jacob's expression grew serious as he leaned against his workbench. "But there's something you should know, Anthony. Ezekiel Zook isn't just fighting against music, he's fighting his own past. His brother Samuel was once considered a prodigy on the fiddle. When Samuel left the community to pursue music, it nearly destroyed their family. Ezekiel has been trying to prevent history from repeating itself. This piece of information cast new light on the tension Anthony had encountered with Ezekiel. What must it be like to see your son walking the same path that tore your family apart? Yet how could anyone deny such obvious talent, such pure devotion to craft? Sarah knows, Jacob added softly. She's been helping Eli hide his work. That girl has wisdom beyond her years, understanding that some gifts are too precious to suppress. The mention of Sarah brought to mind her quiet strength, the way she navigated between tradition and truth. Like Clara had done, Sarah seemed to understand that love sometimes meant protecting others' dreams, even when those dreams challenged everything you'd been taught to believe. Jacob reached for another piece of maple wood, his fingers finding the grain with practiced ease. The question now isn't about Eli's talent, it's about what happens when talent meets opportunity. And that, my friend, is where you come in. The weight of responsibility settled on Anthony's shoulders as he considered Jacob's words. How could he help guide Eli's gift without destroying the young man's place in his community? What would Clara have advised in this delicate dance between tradition and passion? As if reading his thoughts, Jacob offered one final insight. Sometimes, Anthony, the greatest acts of faith aren't in holding fast to what we've always known, but in trusting that the music God places in our hearts has purpose beyond our understanding. The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves through Lancaster County that morning. It brought with it whispers of change, stirring through the Zook family's barn like an unwelcome guest. Ezekiel Zook stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping a partially carved piece of maple wood hidden beneath hay bales in Eli's workshop corner. The discovery confirmed his worst fears. His son had not abandoned his forbidden pursuit of violin crafting. The morning's routine inspection of the barn had led Ezekiel to this moment, each step heavy with the weight of parental duty. Small, wood shavings carefully swept into corners told a story of dedication and secrecy. Tiny pencil markings on wood pieces spoke of precision and passion. These were not the marks of casual interest, but of someone who had studied the craft intently. Sarah watched from the barn entrance, her heart racing as she observed her father's discovery. She had helped Eli conceal his work for months, but now, the delicate balance they had maintained threatened to collapse. The morning light streaming through the barn windows cast long shadows across Ezekiel's face, deepening the lines of worry etched there. Memories of his own brother's departure from the community years ago flooded Ezekiel's mind. The same passion for music had led his brother down a path that ultimately separated him from their faith and family. Would Eli follow the same trajectory? The thought sent a chill through Ezekiel's body that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Meanwhile, in his workshop on the outskirts of town, Jacob Miller examined the violin pieces Eli had shown him days before. The craftsmanship revealed a natural talent that reminded him of conversations with Sir Anthony Hopkins about nurturing gifted young artists. But how could they protect Eli's gift while respecting the delicate boundaries of his community? Sir Anthony, sorting through his late wife Clara's sheet music in his study, felt an inexplicable sense of unease. The morning's stillness carried a tension he couldn't quite name. His thoughts turned to Eli, remembering the boy's eyes lighting up at the sight of Clara's violin collection. How many others had recognized the spark of genuine talent in the young man? In the Zook household kitchen, Sarah kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary, her mind racing with possible solutions. She understood both her father's fears and her brother's passion. The community had lost too many young people to the allure of the English world, yet she had witnessed firsthand how this creative outlet had given Eli purpose and joy. Eli, unaware of his father's discovery, worked in the fields, his calloused hands moving automatically through familiar tasks, while his mind wandered to the violin pieces waiting to be born from raw wood. He had learned to hide his true passion behind a facade of dutiful farm work, but for how long could such a significant part of himself remain in the shadows? The question of artistic expression versus traditional values had long simmered beneath the surface of their community. Where was the line between God-given talent and worldly temptation? How could one honor both their faith and their gifts? These questions echoed through generations of their people, finding no easy answers. Ezekiel carefully replaced the wood pieces exactly as he had found them, his movements deliberate and heavy with indecision. Should he confront Eli immediately, seek counsel from the church elders? Or perhaps most difficult of all, examine his own fears about what this discovery meant for his family's future? The relationship between father and son had already grown strained over the past year, with Eli's increasing withdrawal into himself and Ezekiel's mounting concerns about outside influences. Sarah had watched this silent struggle, serving as an unofficial mediator while carrying her own burden of divided loyalties. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob Miller understood the complexity of the situation better than most. As someone who worked with both the English and Amish communities, he had witnessed similar struggles before. But Eli's talent was exceptional, the kind that comes along perhaps once in a generation. Would keeping it hidden truly serve God's purpose? The morning wore on, each character moving through their day carrying the weight of unspoken words and uncertain futures. The discovery in the barn had set in motion events that would force them all to confront difficult truths about tradition, talent, and the price of staying true to oneself. What would happen when these carefully maintained secrets finally came to light? How would their small community handle the revelation of Eli's hidden talent? And most importantly, could there be a way to honor both tradition and the undeniable call of artistic expression that seemed to run so deeply in the Zook family blood? In the dim light of Anthony's workshop, where wood shavings scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, Eli Zook stood with his eyes closed, hands hovering over a violin. Anthony watched the young man's fingers tremble slightly, remembering how Clara used to say that music lived in the spaces between heartbeats. "Music isn't just what we hear," Anthony said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent understanding this truth. "It's what we feel in our bones, in our blood." He thought of Clara, how she would press her hands against the piano's wooden frame to feel the vibrations even after her hearing began to fade. Eli's fingers twitched, responding to an invisible rhythm. The boy's natural intuition for craftsmanship had always impressed Anthony, but this lesson was different. After Ezekiel's discovery of Eli's secret violin-making endeavors, they needed to be more careful, more deliberate in their approach. How could they preserve the spirit of music without drawing attention through its sound? Sarah had warned them earlier that morning, slipping a note under Anthony's door about their father's growing suspicions. The siblings' silent communication system had evolved over years of protecting each other's dreams from their father's rigid expectations. Now, that system would prove crucial in maintaining their musical sanctuary. "Tell me what you feel when you touch the grain of the wood," Anthony instructed, placing a piece of maple in Eli's hands. The boy's fingers traced the lines with the same reverence Jacob Miller had shown when examining instruments at his shop in town. "It's like the wood has memories," Eli whispered, his voice carrying the same quiet wonder that Clara used to express when discovering a new piece of music. "Each line tells a story of growth, of seasons passing." Anthony nodded, remembering how Jacob had once described the process of selecting wood for violins. "The tree rings are nature's sheet music," he said, watching Eli's expression shift from concentration to understanding. "Each layer represents a different note in the symphony of its life." The relationship between mentor and student had grown beyond mere instruction in craftsmanship. In these quiet moments, they were creating something more profound than instruments. They were preserving a legacy of understanding that transcended the physical limitations of their world. Sarah's occasional visits to the workshop had added another layer to their sessions. Her practical wisdom helped bridge the gap between their musical aspirations and the realities of their community's expectations. She understood the delicate balance required, having watched their uncle, Ezekiel's brother, leave the community years ago to pursue his own musical calling. "Can you feel the difference between this piece and the one we examined last week?" Anthony guided Eli's hands to another section of wood. The contrast in density and grain pattern told its own story, one that would eventually translate into subtle variations in tone and resonance. As they worked, Anthony reflected on how Clara would have appreciated these lessons in silent musicianship. She had always maintained that true music began in the heart, long before it reached the ears. When her hearing failed in her final years, she had taught Anthony to experience music through touch and vibration, through the visual poetry of movement and form. The workshop had become more than a place of instruction. It was a sanctuary where multiple generations of musical understanding converged. Jacob Miller's occasional visits brought news of the outside world's musical developments, while Sarah's quiet support maintained their connection to the community's traditions. But the growing tension with Ezekiel cast a shadow over their work. How long could they continue these lessons without confrontation? The question hung in the air like an unresolved chord, seeking resolution. "Your father's fear comes from a place of love," Anthony said carefully, watching Eli's hands still over the wood. "He wants to protect you from what he sees as a path away from your heritage." The words echoed with the complexity of their situation. The delicate balance between honoring tradition and nurturing individual gifts. Eli's response was thoughtful, measured in the way Sarah had taught him to be. "But isn't music part of our heritage too? Wasn't that why Uncle left?" The question opened doors to memories and possibilities that neither could fully explore in that moment. Instead, they returned to their silent work, letting their hands speak the language that their voices couldn't. In the quiet of the workshop, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the raw materials of future instruments, they continued their symphony without sound. What melodies would these moments of understanding eventually produce? How would the quiet lessons in Anthony's workshop shape the future of a young man caught between two worlds? The answers lay somewhere in the grain of the wood beneath their fingers, in the unspoken songs that filled their hearts. Sarah Zook's fingers worked methodically through the evening's dishes, but her mind dwelled on the growing complexity of her family's situation. Through the kitchen window, she observed her brother Eli's silhouette disappearing into the twilight, heading toward Sir Anthony Hopkins's property for another clandestine lesson. How many secrets could one family bear before they splintered, apart like dry kindling? The weight of her dual role, dutiful Amish daughter and protective sister, pressed heavily upon her shoulders. At 23, Sarah had already mastered the art of diversion, particularly when it came to their father Ezekiel's increasingly frequent inquiries about Eli's whereabouts. "He's helping Jacob Miller with the new barn raising," she would say, "or he's attending to the horses in the far pasture." Each careful lie tasted bitter on her tongue, yet she swallowed them down for Eli's sake. The relationship between Sir Anthony and Eli had blossomed into something far more significant than mere music lessons. Sarah recognized in their connection echoes of what their family had lost when their uncle abandoned the community for a life of music. Perhaps this was why their father's opposition ran so deep, the fear of history repeating itself, of losing another family member to the English world's siren song. Through her careful observation, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in Eli. His movements had become more deliberate, almost graceful, as if he were constantly listening to an internal rhythm. During their quiet moments together, he would share fragments of his lessons with Sir Anthony, not just about music, but about life, loss, and the delicate balance between tradition and personal truth. These conversations reminded Sarah of their mother's gentle wisdom, now preserved only in memory. The growing bond between Sir Anthony and Eli seemed to fill a void that Ezekiel's stern devotion to tradition could not. Sarah understood this better than most, having witnessed her father's grief transform into rigid adherence to their way of life after their mother's passing. Yet she also saw how Sir Anthony's own loss, the death of his beloved Clara, had opened his heart to teaching Eli, creating a healing connection for both mentor and student. Jacob Miller's occasional visits added another layer of complexity to their situation. His position as a bridge between the English and Amish communities made him an invaluable ally, though Sarah sometimes wondered if his involvement might eventually draw unwanted attention to Eli's musical pursuits. Still, Jacob's presence provided a legitimate excuse for Eli's absences, and Sarah was grateful for his silent support. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted Sarah's thoughts. She quickly resumed her work as Ezekiel entered the kitchen, his face bearing the familiar worried expression she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Where is your brother?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of suspicion. Sarah's heart quickened, but her hands remained steady as she dried another plate. "He mentioned helping with the miller's new colt," she replied, the practiced words flowing smoothly. Would there ever come a day when such deceptions weren't necessary? When music could be discussed openly in their home without fear of judgment or consequences? As Ezekiel nodded and turned away, Sarah caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Not just concern, but a deep-seated fear. Did he suspect the truth? Could he sense the subtle changes in his son, the way Eli's spirit seemed to soar despite their earthbound existence? Sarah understood her father's fear of losing his children to the outside world, but she also recognized the cost of suppressing one's true nature. The evening light continued to fade, and Sarah's thoughts turned to Sir Anthony's home, where she knew Eli was learning to feel music in ways their community had never imagined possible. She thought of Clara's piano, silent, yet somehow still alive with possibility, and of Sir Anthony's patient guidance. How strange that an English widower could understand her brother's soul in ways their own father couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. Through the window, Sarah watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Soon Eli would return, carrying, with him, the invisible marks of his musical education. She would be waiting, ready to cover his tracks and preserve his secret, all while praying for the day when truth could finally ring out as clearly as the notes her brother longed to play. Until then, she would remain vigilant, a guardian of her brother's dreams, watching and waiting as the symphony of their lives continued to unfold in unexpected ways. In the dim light of a kerosene lamp, Sarah's fingers trembled as she held the weathered envelope she'd discovered while cleaning the attic. The return address bore a name that hadn't been spoken in their household for over a decade: Benjamin Zook, her father's younger brother. The letter, dated 15 years ago, remained sealed, its contents preserved by time and silence. What secrets could have driven her uncle to abandon their way of life? The question had haunted Sarah since childhood, whispered about in hushed tones when adults thought children weren't listening. She remembered Benjamin's violin music floating through summer evenings, how her father's face would soften at the sound before the memory of his brother's departure hardened it again. Sarah glanced toward her bedroom door, listening for any movement in the house. Eli was with Anthony Hopkins, protected by her careful watch, while their father attended a community meeting. The timing felt providential, as if Clara's spirit had orchestrated this moment of discovery. With careful movements, Sarah broke the seal, conscious of how this simple act might alter everything she understood about her family. The letter's contents spilled forth in elegant handwriting, each word carrying the weight of Benjamin's choice. "Dearest brother," it began, "by the time you read this, I will have joined the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't known her uncle had achieved such success. The letter continued, describing the impossible choice. Between faith and music, between family bonds and artistic calling, Benjamin's words revealed a deeper truth about their family's musical heritage. Their grandfather had been a violin maker before joining the Amish community, passing his craft secretly to Benjamin. This revelation illuminated Eli's inherited talent with new significance. Her brother wasn't just defying tradition, he was reclaiming a legacy. The letter spoke of sacrifice and understanding, of hoping someday Ezekiel would comprehend that following one's calling didn't mean rejecting faith or family. Benjamin had enclosed a program from his first symphony performance, now yellowed with age, never seen by its intended recipient. Sarah wondered if her father's refusal to read the letter had less to do with anger and more to do with fear. Fear of understanding, of forgiveness, of his own suppressed longings. Sarah's mind turned to Anthony Hopkins, seeing him now as more than just Eli's mentor. He represented a bridge between worlds, much like her uncle had sought to be. The parallel between Benjamin's journey and Eli's current path struck her with crystal clarity. Would history repeat itself? Or could understanding their past help forge a different future? The letter's final paragraphs offered something unexpected: an olive branch. Benjamin had included his address, phone number, and a standing invitation for reconciliation. Music isn't just in our blood, Ezekiel, he wrote. It's in our soul. Whether we play it, craft it, or simply listen, it connects us to something greater than ourselves. Sarah carefully refolded the letter, her mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a historical document, it was a key to understanding the forces pulling at her family. The question now wasn't just about protecting Eli's secret violin lessons. It was about healing generational wounds. Through the window, she caught sight of Anthony Hopkins's house in the distance, its warm lights a beacon in the gathering dusk. She thought of Clara, whose piano had drawn Anthony to this community, creating ripples that continued to affect their lives. Was it coincidence that brought him here, or something more purposeful? The sound of a wagon approaching snapped Sarah back to the present moment. She quickly secured the letter in a hidden compartment of her hope chest, alongside the small notebook where she documented Eli's progress with the violin. These secrets, she realized, weren't just burdens to bear. They were threads that might eventually weave her fractured family back together. But first, she needed to decide, would sharing this letter help bridge the divide between father and son, or would it only deepen the chasm? And what of Benjamin himself? Could he be the ally they needed in helping Eli pursue his musical gifts without losing his place in the community? The answers weren't clear, but Sarah knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer just protecting Eli's present. She was now guardian of their family's past and, possibly, its future. The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves through the Lancaster County woods that evening. Melodies, tentative at first, then growing bolder, wove through the branches as Eli Zook and Sir Anthony Hopkins worked in the gathering darkness. Their breath visible in the cool air, they stood beside an ancient oak tree, sheets of music paper illuminated by a battery-operated lantern. "Listen to how the wind moves through the trees," Anthony instructed, his weathered hands conducting an invisible orchestra. "Nature provides the finest inspiration for composition." He hummed a few notes, matching the whisper of branches above. Them. Eli closed his eyes, absorbing the lesson while clutching his violin case closer. The young man's fingers twitched against the leather handle, muscle memory already translating the natural sounds into potential finger positions on his instruments. But tonight wasn't about playing, it was about creating. Anthony had insisted they focus on composition, believing that understanding how to write music would deepen Eli's appreciation for performing it. Sarah's discovery of their uncle's letter had sparked something in Eli, a need to express the tumult of emotions through music. How many others in their community had buried their artistic passions? The question haunted him as he watched Anthony sketch notes across the staff paper, each mark deliberate and precise. "Music speaks what cannot be said in words," Anthony murmured, remembering Clara's favorite saying. He glanced at Eli, noting how the boy's expression mirrored his own during those early days of composition study. "Your uncle understood this just as you do now." Eli's pencil moved across his own sheet, hesitant at first but gaining confidence. The melody forming in his mind drew from something deeper than the evening sounds around them. It carried echoes of Sarah's quiet humming as she worked, his father's stern voice softening when speaking of their mother, and the memory of his uncle's violin singing through the barn walls years ago. Anthony watched his student work, recognizing the moment when technical exercise transformed into genuine creative expression. It reminded him of Clara's face when she would lose herself in a particularly moving piece at her piano. The same intensity, the same connection to something beyond the physical world of notes and measures. "Sir Anthony," Eli whispered, not wanting to break the spell of concentration, "how do you capture feeling in notation?" His pencil hovered over a particularly challenging passage where the technical elements failed to convey the emotion he sought to express. The question transported Anthony back to his early days of composition at the Royal Academy. How many times had he struggled with the same challenge? Music isn't just about the notes, Eli. It's about the spaces between them, the tension and release, the journey from one phrase to the next. Their collaboration deepened as the night progressed, with Anthony guiding Eli through the intricacies of harmony and counterpoint. The young man's natural instincts for melody, honed through years of secret practice, began to bloom under proper instruction. Together they crafted a piece that spoke of longing, of tradition wrestling with change, of family bonds tested but unbroken. In the distance, a whip-poor-will called, its song joining their musical conversation. Anthony smiled, remembering how Clara would often say that nature's musicians were the finest teachers. The bird's rhythmic calls found their way into Eli's composition, bridging the gap between his two worlds, the structured discipline of classical music and the organic harmony of his Amish heritage. As they worked, neither man noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the forest edge. Sarah stood silently, witness to this forbidden collaboration between English and Amish, teacher and student, artist and apprentice. Her uncle's letter seemed to burn in her apron pocket, its words echoing in the melodies floating through the trees. The completion of their night's work approached with the rising moon. Eli studied the pages before him, covered in corrections and marginalia from Anthony's experienced hand. How would Jacob Miller react to this composition? The thought of sharing their creation with the violin maker both thrilled and terrified him. Anthony gathered their materials, careful to keep the pages ordered. Remember, Eli, every great composer started exactly where you are now, with a blank page and a heart full of music. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Your uncle made his choice, but his story doesn't have to be yours. There are always more paths than we first perceive. The papers disappeared into Eli's violin case, hidden but not forgotten, like so many secrets in their complex lives. As they prepared to part ways, the night's silence was broken by distant hoofbeats. Whether friend or foe approached remained to be seen, but the music they had created could not be uncreated. The question now was, what would be the cost of its existence? In the pre-dawn stillness, Eli Zook stood beneath a canopy of maple trees, his violin tucked beneath his chin. The morning dew settled on his shoulders as he listened intently to the first stirrings of birdsong. Anthony Hopkins had taught him that music existed everywhere, in the rustling leaves, in the morning breeze, and especially in the chorus of birds that welcomed each new day. A cardinal's distinct call pierced the air, its clear notes rising and falling in a pattern that caught Eli's attention. He raised his bow, attempting to match the bird's melody, but the notes came out forced and mechanical. How could something so natural be so difficult to replicate? Anthony's words from their previous evening's lesson echoed in his mind. Don't just play the notes, Eli. Feel the spirit behind them. The older man's guidance had become a constant presence in Eli's thoughts, much like the memory of his mother's gentle humming when she would work in their garden. Both represented a connection to music that transcended mere technical skill. Sarah had noticed the change in her brother over the past weeks. During their quiet conversations while completing evening chores, she observed how Eli's descriptions of sound had evolved. He no longer spoke simply of notes and rhythms, but of conversations between wind and leaves, of stories told through birdsong. Their father, Ezekiel, remained unaware of these subtle transformations, too consumed by his own rigid interpretations of their community's traditions. A chickadee joined the cardinal's song, creating an intricate duet that captured Eli's imagination. He closed his eyes, allowing the natural melody to wash over him. This time, when he raised his bow, he didn't try to copy the birds exactly. Instead, he let his violin speak in response to their calls, creating a musical dialogue that bridged the gap between human artifice and natural expression. Jacob Miller, passing by on his morning walk to check his beehives, paused at the edge of the woods. The sound drawing him closer wasn't the precise traditional hymns typically associated with Amish music, nor was it the classical pieces he'd heard in concert halls. This was something entirely different, a fusion of worlds that spoke to both earth and sky. The violin's voice soared through the trees, carrying with it echoes of Clara's influence. Anthony had often spoken of how his late wife could translate the language of nature into piano music, creating pieces that captured the essence of a summer storm or the first frost of winter. Now, through Eli's bow, that same gift was finding new expression. As the sun climbed higher, Eli's improvisation evolved. He wove together threads of birdsong with fragments of the hymns he'd grown up singing, creating a tapestry of sound that reflected both his heritage and his growing artistic voice. Each phrase carried questions. How could such different musical traditions exist in harmony? What would his father say if he could hear these experiments in sound? The morning's practice session represented more than just musical development. It marked another step in Eli's journey between worlds, the traditional Amish life he'd always known, and the broader artistic existence that Anthony had introduced him to. Sarah understood this precarious balance, having watched their uncle choose between his music and his place in the community years ago. Beyond the trees, the day was beginning in earnest. The distant sound of horses and buggies signaled the start of another workday, a reminder of the responsibilities and expectations that awaited. But for these precious morning moments, Eli had found a way to exist in both worlds, his violin serving as a bridge between tradition and innovation, between earth and air, between what was and what could be. The birds gradually shifted their songs, responding to the violin's presence in their morning chorus. They neither rejected nor fully embraced this new voice, but accepted it as part of the morning's natural symphony. In this acceptance, Eli found hope. Perhaps there was a way to honor both his community's traditions and the music that called so strongly to his soul. Anthony would later tell him that these morning sessions were essential not just for musical growth, but for understanding the deeper language of creativity. Every bird's call, every rustle of leaves, every morning breeze carried within it the potential for transformation into something new, while remaining true to its original essence. This was the lesson Eli was learning, note by note, dawn by dawn, as he found his own voice amid nature's endless song. The scent of fresh-cut wood lingered in Eli's workshop as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the barn's weathered slats. Eli Zook's footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, his presence unannounced but heavy with purpose. His fingers traced the workbench, collecting fine sawdust that told tales of recent activity. What would he find in his son's secret sanctuary? Behind a stack of lumber, carefully arranged to appear casual, Ezekiel discovered the first piece of evidence. A violin bridge, expertly carved with precision that spoke of dedication and practice. His weathered hands trembled as he held it to the light, memories of his own brother's departure flooding back. The same brother who had chosen music over family, over tradition. Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart racing as her father methodically uncovered more signs of Eli's forbidden craft. How long had she helped maintain this secret? The weight of divided loyalties pressed heavily upon her shoulders as she observed her father's discovery. The carefully hidden tools, the patterns traced on paper, and the unmistakable outline of a violin body taking shape beneath a worn tarp all pointed to one truth. Eli had not abandoned his passion. In his studio across town, Sir Anthony Hopkins sat with Jacob Miller, discussing the progress of their young protege. Neither man knew of the discovery unfolding in the Zook barn, but both sensed the precipice on which their careful plans balanced. The boy has a gift, Jacob mused, one that reminds me of Clara's natural ability to hear music in everything. Anthony's eyes softened at the mention of his late wife. Would Clara have seen the same potential in Eli that he recognized? The thought of her gentle guidance, the way she could coax melody from the most reluctant student, seemed to float through the room like a half-remembered song. Meanwhile, Eli worked in the fields, unaware of the storm brewing at home. His mind wandered to the bird songs he had learned to translate into violin music, his fingers unconsciously moving through the positions as he worked. The memory of Sir Anthony's lessons merged with the natural symphony around him. But for how much longer would these lessons continue? Ezekiel's discovery forced long-buried questions to the surface. How had his son managed to continue this deception? The craftsmanship displayed in the hidden works spoke of instruction beyond mere curiosity. His thoughts turned to Sir Anthony Hopkins, the Englisher who had appeared in their lives with too much interest in his children. The connection became clear, igniting a fury that had simmered since his brother's departure years ago. Sarah stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence in the workshop. Should she speak in defense of her brother, or maintain the expected obedience to their father? The choice weighed upon her like the approaching storm clouds gathering over their farm. Her role as mediator had never felt more crucial, nor more impossible. The evidence laid out before them told a story of dedication, of secret lessons and hidden talents, but it also spoke of betrayal, of community values challenged, of traditional boundaries crossed. The violin pieces scattered across the workbench represented more than just musical instruments. They embodied the clash between preservation and progress, between duty and dreams. Jacob Miller, having once attempted to reach out to Eli directly, now wondered if their careful approach had been the right choice. Should they have been more open, more direct with Ezekiel from the beginning? The complexity of bridging two worlds, the English and the Amish, had never seemed more daunting. As the day drew to a close, each character stood at a crossroads. Ezekiel clutched the evidence of his son's secret life, torn between anger and an unwanted understanding of the passion that drove such deception. Sarah balanced on the edge of intervention, weighing her loyalty to her brother against her respect for their father. And somewhere in the fields, Eli continued his work, translating nature's music into mental fingerings, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to change. What would come of this discovery? How would the delicate balance between tradition and individual calling resolve itself? The answers hung in the air like the last notes of an unfinished melody, waiting for someone brave enough to complete the song. The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves across the Lancaster County farmland, as Ezekiel Zook's heavy footsteps thundered up Anthony Hopkins' front porch steps. His weathered hands clutched damning evidence, wood shavings and violin, strings discovered in Eli's workshop, proof of continued defiance against the Ordnung's strict regulations on musical instruments. Anthony heard the approaching footsteps and knew immediately who they belonged to. The distinctive rhythm of Amish, work boots coupled with their forceful determination, could only mean Ezekiel had discovered their secret. Through the window he caught sight of Sarah Zook hurrying across the field separating their properties, her black dress billowing in the wind as she raced to intervene. The door flew open before Ezekiel could knock. "I trusted you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal. "You gave me your word that you would respect our ways." He thrust forward the handful of wood shavings, letting them scatter across Anthony's floor like accusations. Anthony maintained his composure, though his heart ached for the young man who had shown such promise in craft and music. How could he explain to this father that his son's talent was a gift that transcended religious boundaries? The memory of Clara, his late wife, seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him of music's power to heal and unite. "Your son has a gift, Ezekiel," Anthony said quietly. "A gift that comes from the same source as your craftsmanship with furniture." He gestured to the finely made rocking chair Ezekiel himself had built for the community auction last spring. "Would you deny him the chance to express his faith through this talent?" Ezekiel's face reddened beneath his beard. "You speak of faith, yet you encourage my son to break our sacred traditions. Where was your respect for faith when you taught him to craft these instruments in secret?" His voice carried across the room, each word striking like hammer blows. Sarah appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, her presence adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. She looked between the two men, understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. Her brother's future hung in the balance, along with the delicate peace their community had maintained with their English neighbor. "Father," she began, but Ezekiel raised his hand to silence her. "This goes beyond Eli," Ezekiel continued, turning back to Anthony. "You've disrupted our family's peace, just as music disrupted our community when my own brother chose it over his faith." The pain of that old wound surfaced in his eyes, revealing the deeper roots of his opposition. Anthony considered his next words carefully, knowing they could either bridge the divide or widen it irreparably. "Your brother's choices were his own, Ezekiel, but Eli seeks to honor both his faith and his gifts. He speaks of God's glory when he works the wood, just as Jacob Miller told me you once did in your youth." The mention of Jacob Miller's name caused Ezekiel to step back, his certainty wavering for a moment. How did Anthony know about those conversations from so long ago? the ones where a young Ezekiel had confided his own dreams of crafting instruments before duty and tradition had reshaped his path. Sarah moved closer, her quiet strength offering support to both men. "Father, perhaps we should listen to what Mr. Hopkins has to say. Eli's heart remains true to our ways, even as he explores this craft." The room fell silent save for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, its rhythm marking the moments as 3 lives stood at a crossroads. Through the window, the setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, much like the shadows of doubt now crossing Ezekiel's face. What would it take to bridge the gap between tradition and talent, between a father's fear and a son's calling? As Anthony looked at Ezekiel, he saw not just an angry father, but a man wrestling with his own unfulfilled dreams. Could the very thing that had driven their community apart years ago now serve as the thread to stitch it back together? The answer lay somewhere between the scattered wood shavings on the floor and the unspoken prayers in their hearts. But would they find it before the divide became too wide to cross? The evening air hung heavy with tension as Eli Zook stood in Anthony Hopkins' workshop, his weathered hands trembling with barely contained fury. The violin, Eli's secret masterpiece, lay between them on the workbench, its polished surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. "This ends now." Ezekiel's voice carried the weight of generations of tradition. His fingers closed around the instrument, the same way they had gripped the reins of authority over his family for years. "My son will not follow the path of my brother." Anthony watched, his heart racing as he recognized the same desperate fear he'd seen in Clara's father years ago, when he'd forbidden her from pursuing her music. How many dreams had been shattered by the hands of well-meaning parents? "Ezekiel, think carefully about what you're doing. That violin represents more than just music. It's your son's gift." Sarah stood in the doorway, her presence a silent witness to the unfolding drama. She'd arrived moments after her father, having followed him when she noticed his unusual departure from their farm. Her eyes met Anthony's, sharing an unspoken understanding of what was at stake. "A gift?" Ezekiel's laugh held no warmth. "This is a temptation, placed here by you, Englisher, just as you tempted my brother with promises of a different life." His grip tightened on the violin's neck, knuckles white with determination. Eli burst through the door, his young face flushed from running. "Dad, please!" The word caught in his throat as he saw his father holding his creation. Months of secret work, countless hours of careful crafting, all balanced precariously in his father's grasp. The workshop fell silent, save for the soft creaking of the old floorboards beneath their feet. Anthony thought of Clara, of how she would handle this moment. She always knew how to reach through walls of fear with gentle understanding. But before he could channel her wisdom, the tension snapped. In one fluid motion, Ezekiel raised the violin above his head. Time seemed to slow as the instrument arced through the air, its journey ending with a sickening crack against the corner of the workbench. The sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot, followed by the tinkling of splintered wood falling to the floor. Sarah's gasp pierced the silence. Eli stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the scattered pieces of his dream. The broken strings curled like dying things among the shards of maple and spruce, wood he'd carefully selected with Jacob Miller's guidance, shaped with Anthony's tools, and imbued with his own spirit. Anthony felt the loss as physically as if someone had struck him. Not just for the instrument, but for the echo of Clara it carried, for the bridge it represented between two worlds, for the hope it held for Eli's future. He watched as Ezekiel's rage drained away, replaced by something closer to horror at his own actions. "You would destroy your son's talent to protect him from it?" Anthony's voice was quiet but carried the weight of years watching young artists struggle against the tide of expectation. "What are you really afraid of, Ezekiel?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but stirring something in the older man's eyes. Sarah moved to her brother's side, her arm around his shoulders as silent tears tracked down his cheeks. The broken violin lay between them all, a physical manifestation of the fractures running through their lives. Ezekiel looked at his children, then at the destruction at his feet. His hands, so sure in their righteous anger moments ago, now trembled slightly as he reached for a piece of the shattered instrument. "I cannot lose another," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. They stretched between the gathered figures like the strings of an invisible instrument, connecting them in ways they had yet to understand. The question remained, could anything beautiful emerge from such destruction, or would this moment mark the end of more than just a violin? Jacob Miller's words from weeks ago echoed in Anthony's mind. Sometimes the strongest music comes from broken places. As he watched Eli kneel to gather the pieces of his ruined work, Anthony wondered if this breaking point might lead to an even more powerful composition, one that could bridge the gap between father and son, between tradition and dreams, between fear and faith. The shattered remains of the violin lay scattered across the workshop floor, each splintered piece a testament to the destructive power of anger. Anthony Hopkins stood motionless, his weathered hands trembling as he recalled another moment of loss, one that had shaped his entire perspective on preserving beauty in the world. 23 years earlier, Clara had sat at their grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as she played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The memory was so vivid that Anthony could almost hear the gentle notes floating through the air. She had stopped mid-phrase, turning to him with those knowing eyes that had always seen straight through to his soul. "What happens to music when no one remembers to play it?" she had asked, her question hanging in the air like the lingering resonance of a final note. "It dies, Anthony. It dies the quietest death of all." Those words echoed in Anthony's mind now, as he gazed at the destroyed violin, remembering how Clara had devoted her life to teaching young musicians, believing that every piece of music needed new hands to keep it alive. The parallel between her mission and his current situation with Eli Zook struck him with painful clarity. Sarah Zook's soft footsteps interrupted his reverie as she entered the workshop, her sharp intake of breath at the sight of the destruction, drawing Anthony back to the present. "Mr. Hopkins," she whispered, "what happened?" The question stirred something deeper in Anthony's memories. Clara had faced similar moments of despair when her students gave up, when parents dismissed music as frivolous, when illness began to steal away her ability to play, yet she had never surrendered to despair. "Your father," Anthony began, his voice rough with emotion. "He doesn't understand what he's trying to destroy. It's not just about the violin, Sarah, it's about something much more fundamental." Sarah moved carefully through the wreckage, gathering pieces of the shattered instrument. "Eli's heart was in this violin," she said, holding up a fragment of the carefully carved scroll. "I've never seen him pour himself into anything like this before." Anthony watched as Sarah's fingers traced the grain of the wood, reminded of how Clara would touch the piano keys even when she could no longer play, feeling the music that lived within the instrument. "Your brother has a gift," he said. "Clara used to say that talents are like seeds. They'll find a way to grow even through concrete. But they grow stronger with proper nurturing." The mention of Clara brought a fresh wave of memory, her final days when she had made Anthony promise to continue her work of preserving and passing on the arts. She had gripped his hand with surprising strength, her voice clear despite her weakness. "The world needs beauty, Anthony. It needs people who will fight to keep it alive." Jacob Miller's unexpected arrival at the workshop door added another layer to the unfolding drama. He surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, understanding immediately the gravity of what had transpired. "I heard raised voices," he said quietly. "I came as soon as I could." Anthony found himself sharing a look with Sarah, recognizing in her the same determination he had so often seen in Clara's expression. The young woman stood straighter, her decision visibly forming. "We need to fix this," she declared. "Not just the violin, all of it." Clara's voice seemed to whisper in Anthony's mind. "Sometimes, love means standing firm when others would have you bend." He looked at the broken instrument, seeing beyond the physical damage to the deeper wounds it represented. The rift between father and son, the struggle between tradition and passion, The battle between fear and artistic expression. Your father believes he's protecting your brother, Anthony said to Sarah. But Clara taught me that the greatest protection we can offer is the freedom to become who we're meant to be. Jacob moved to examine the scattered pieces of the violin. This can be rebuilt, he said with quiet confidence. Different, perhaps, but possibly stronger than before. His words carried weight beyond the immediate situation, speaking to the potential for healing that lay beneath the surface of their shared crisis. The afternoon light filtered through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across the floor, reminiscent of the way Clara's music had once filled empty spaces with meaning. Anthony felt her presence strongly in that moment, guiding him toward what needed to be done next. The question wasn't whether to continue, but how to proceed in a way that would honor both the art and the complex web of relationships involved. What would Clara do in this situation? She had always found ways to bridge seemingly impossible gaps, to help people understand the value of preserving and nurturing artistic expression. The answer began to form in Anthony's mind, inspired by her memory and shaped by the present reality of their circumstances. In the dim light of his study, Ezekiel, Zook held a weathered envelope between trembling fingers. The letter, hidden for nearly 2 decades in the family Bible, bore his brother's distinctive handwriting. Why had he chosen this moment to finally confront these words from his past? Perhaps it was the growing tension with his son Eli or the unsettling presence of Sir Anthony Hopkins in their lives that made the timing feel significant. As Ezekiel unfolded the yellowed paper, memories of his brother's departure from their Amish community flooded back. The choice between faith and music had torn their family apart, much like the current struggle threatening to separate him from Eli. His brother's words, penned in careful script, began to reveal themselves. Dearest Ezekiel, by the time you read this, I will have already crossed the boundary between our world and the English one. I pray you'll understand that this decision comes not from a place of rejection, but from an undeniable calling that burns within me. The music, Ezekiel. It speaks to my soul in ways our father could never comprehend. Sarah Zook, watching her father from the doorway, noticed how his shoulders tensed with each line he read. She had discovered the letter years ago, but had kept its existence secret, understanding its explosive potential. Now, as her father confronted these long-buried words, she wondered if they might help him understand Eli's similar struggle. The letter continued, drawing parallels that seemed almost prophetic. Remember how our father would say that pride leads to destruction? But what if what he saw as pride was actually a gift from God? The same God who gave us the ability to craft beautiful things, with our hands to raise barns together, to sing our hymns, didn't he also create music in all its forms? Sir Anthony Hopkins, meanwhile, sat in his study across town, unaware of this unfolding family drama. He was lost in thoughts of his late wife, Clara, remembering how she had once spoken about the universal language of music. Art knows no boundaries, she would say. It speaks to the soul regardless of one's beliefs or background. How similar her words were to those in the letter Ezekiel now read. The letter took an unexpected turn as Ezekiel's brother addressed the future. I fear that someday, you might face this same challenge with your own children. If that day comes, remember how it felt to watch me leave. Remember the pain of choosing between tradition and understanding. Don't let pride cost you what matters most. Family. Eli, working late in Jacob Miller's workshop on a violin restoration, felt an inexplicable connection to this moment. Though unaware of his uncle's letter, he shared the same spiritual struggle, the same pull between two worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. Jacob observed the young man's careful work, recognizing in him the same passion that had driven others to choose between their art and their community. As Ezekiel reached the letter's final paragraphs, his brother's words cut deeper. The English world isn't the godless place our elders feared. I've found that music brings people closer to God in ways our community never imagined. The violin I craft, the melodies I play, they're my prayers, my way of honoring our Creator. Sarah stepped quietly into the study, drawn by her father's unusual silence. The tension in the room was palpable, as Ezekiel confronted not just his brother's words, but the mirror they held up to his present situation. Would history repeat itself? Would another generation of their family be torn apart by this same conflict between tradition and artistic calling? The letter concluded with a hope for reconciliation. Perhaps someday, when time has softened these hard edges, you'll understand that following one's calling doesn't mean abandoning faith. Until then, know that you remain in my prayers and that my door will always be open. Ezekiel folded the letter carefully, his hand steadier now but his mind turbulent with questions. How had his brother's words, written so many years ago, become such a precise reflection of his current struggle with Eli? And more importantly, what would he do with this newfound perspective on the age-old conflict between tradition and personal calling? The weight of his brother's words hung heavy in Ezekiel Zook's weathered hands as the letter trembled slightly in the dim lamplight. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, each flake carrying with it the silence that only December could bring. Inside the Zook home, that same silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the occasional crackle from the wood stove. Sarah watched her father from the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. How many years had passed since anyone had spoken her uncle's name aloud? The memory of him had become like a shadow in their home, present but never acknowledged. Now through ink and paper, he had found his voice again. Across the room, Eli sat perched on the edge of the wooden bench, his fingers unconsciously moving in the patterns of violin fingerings, a habit he'd developed during moments of anxiety. His gaze darted between his father's face and Sarah's steady presence, searching for any sign of what would come next. The letter had arrived unexpectedly that morning, delivered by Jacob Miller, who had received it from Sir Anthony Hopkins. How many hands had touched these pages before they reached their intended recipient? How many years had this message waited to be delivered? "He speaks of music," Ezekiel finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of how it filled his soul until he could contain it no longer." The words seemed to pain him, as though each syllable carried the weight of ancient grief. "He says he hopes we understand now, after all these years." Sarah moved closer to her father, her steps careful and measured. "Do you, Dad, understand?" The question hung in the air like the snow outside, delicate yet impossible to ignore. Ezekiel's hands tightened on the paper, creating new creases among the old. His eyes met Eli's across the room, and something shifted in their depths. "Understanding and accepting are not always the same thing," he replied, each word carefully chosen. "Your uncle chose his path as each of us must choose our own." Eli's fingers stilled their phantom playing. Was this an opening? A subtle acknowledgement of the choices that lay before him? Sir Anthony had shown him a world where music wasn't just heard but felt, where creating beauty wasn't a sin but a gift. The violin waiting in the Englishman's workshop called to him like a voice in the night. "The world he describes," Ezekiel continued, his voice softer now, "it's full of lights and sounds and things that have no place in our way of life. And yet," he paused, looking down at the letter again, "and yet he writes of finding God in the music, of feeling closer to heaven through the notes he plays." Sarah moved to sit beside her father, her presence offering silent support. How many times had she stood between the old ways and the new, trying to bridge the gap that seemed to widen with each passing day? She thought of Sir Anthony, of his patient understanding, and the way he spoke of his late wife Clara's music, as though it were a living thing, breathing beauty into the world. "What troubles me most," Ezekiel admitted, "is not that he left but that I never tried to understand why he stayed away. Pride, perhaps, or fear of what his words might mean for our family." The snow continued to fall outside, each flake adding to the blanket of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something new and unknown. Inside, the silence had changed its character, from heavy and oppressive to thoughtful and expectant. Eli found his voice at last. "Dad, when I hold a violin, when I feel the wood and strings beneath my fingers, it's like..." He searched for words that wouldn't wound, that might build bridges instead of walls. It's like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. The confession hung in the air between father and son, as delicate as the snowflakes outside. Would it shatter the moment's fragile peace, or would it find purchase in the newly tilled soil of understanding? Ezekiel looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing not just the boy he'd raised, but the man he was becoming. The letter crinkled softly as he set it aside, its message delivered but its impact still unfolding. Like ripples in still water, what would tomorrow bring for the Zook family? The snow continued to fall, covering the world in possibilities as white and pure as grace itself. Inside the warm kitchen, 3 hearts beat with questions yet unasked, answers yet undiscovered, and hope as fragile and precious as the first notes of a new song. In the hushed hours before dawn, when even the roosters still dreamed, Eli Zook's careful fingers moved across the damaged violin. The instrument lay before him like a wounded bird, its rich maple wood bearing the scars of Ezekiel's anger. Each crack and splinter represented not just physical damage, but the fractures in his family's foundation. Who would have thought that music could cut so deeply into the fabric of their Amish life? The techniques Sir Anthony Hopkins had taught him merged seamlessly with the woodworking skills passed down through generations of Zook men. Eli applied gentle pressure to the seams, his movements precise and deliberate. The ghost of Clara's music seemed to hover in the workshop's shadows, as if Anthony's late wife watched over his restoration efforts. Would she have understood the weight of tradition pressing against the pull of passion? Sarah's footsteps, nearly silent on the wooden floor, announced her arrival before first light. She carried a small oil lamp, its flame casting dancing shadows across the walls. "The English say morning shows the day," she whispered, setting down a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. Inside lay the specialized glue Jacob Miller had secretly provided through their carefully orchestrated network of support. The siblings worked in companionable silence, their movements synchronized by years of shared secrets and mutual understanding. Sarah held pieces steady while Eli applied the adhesive, their breath creating small clouds in the cool morning air. How many more dawns would they need to complete this clandestine restoration? The question hung between them, unspoken but heavy with implications. Meanwhile, across the fields, Sir Anthony Hopkins sat at his window, watching the same pre-dawn sky. His thoughts drifted to Clara, to the way she would practice scales in these quiet hours, her music rising with the sun. The violin in Eli's hands carried echoes of that same dedication. Could the boy's father, Ezekiel, ever understand that music wasn't a threat to their way of life, but rather a different expression of the same divine spirit they honored in their daily prayers? Jacob Miller's involvement added another layer of complexity to their delicate situation. His knowledge of both worlds, the English and the Amish, made him an invaluable ally but also a potential liability. Every time he supplied materials or advice through Sarah's careful intermediary work, they risked discovery. Yet the alternative, leaving the violin broken, along with Eli's dreams, seemed far more devastating. The relationship between mentor and student had evolved beyond mere musical instruction. Anthony recognized in Eli the same fire that had driven Clara, that indefinable spark that transformed notes on a page into something transcendent. Each secret lesson, each shared moment of musical discovery, strengthened their bond while simultaneously straining Eli's connection to his community. Sarah understood the precarious nature of their undertaking better than anyone. As she helped her brother rebuild the instrument, she also worked to maintain the fragile peace within their family. Her position as the eldest daughter, combined with her quiet wisdom, allowed her to navigate the complex currents of tradition and change. But for how long could she continue this careful balancing act? The violin's restoration became a metaphor for their collective hopes, each carefully repaired crack representing a chance for understanding, each strengthened joint symbolizing the possibility of reconciliation. Eli's hands moved with increasing confidence, applying the techniques Anthony had taught him while honoring the craftsmanship his ancestors had passed down through generations. As dawn's first rays pierced the workshop's windows, the siblings stepped back to assess their progress. The violin's wounds were slowly healing, though much work remained. Would their father's heart prove as receptive to repair as this beloved instrument? Could music build a bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding that threatened to divide? their family. The morning light revealed the true extent of their challenge, not just in restoring the violin, but in preserving their family's unity while honoring individual gifts. As Eli carefully wrapped the instrument in its protective cloth, Sarah's hand found his shoulder, offering silent support. Together they faced the rising sun, knowing that each dawn brought them closer to an inevitable confrontation between tradition and change, between duty and dreams. The first rays of morning light filtered through the workshop windows as Eli Zook held the newly restored violin in his trembling hands. The instrument gleamed with fresh varnish, its wounds healed through hours of patient craftsmanship. But would its voice still sing? Could it capture the essence of the melody that had haunted his dreams? The one his mother used to hum while working in their garden? Sir Anthony Hopkins watched from his customary corner, his weathered hands clasped together as Eli raised the violin to his shoulder. The boy's hesitation spoke volumes about the weight of this moment. This wasn't just about playing music. It was about bridging the chasm between past and present, between what was lost and what might still be found. Sarah stood in the doorway, her presence both protective and encouraging. She alone understood the full significance of what her brother was attempting. Their mother's song had been their secret language, a melody passed down without notation or formal instruction. How many times had she heard Eli practicing it in the barn, thinking himself alone? The first note wavered, uncertain, like a bird testing its wings. But then Eli's confidence grew and the melody began to take shape. It wasn't the polished performance of a trained musician, but something far more precious, the raw emotion of a son reaching across time to touch his mother's memory. The tune spoke of summer evenings and gentle hands, of laughter in the kitchen and quiet moments in the garden. Sir Anthony found himself transported to his own memories of Clara, her fingers dancing across piano keys, creating magic from mere wood and wire. How strange that grief could forge such unexpected connections between an English musician and an Amish boy. He glanced at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same recognition of music's power to heal. Outside the workshop, Jacob Miller paused in his morning walk, drawn by the sound. He'd heard countless violins in his time, but this was different. The melody carried the simplicity of folk music, but held depths that spoke of something more profound. Could this be what he'd sensed in Eli all along? The song built to its crescendo, each note carrying the weight of unspoken words and unexpressed longing. What would Ezekiel think if he could hear his son now? Would he recognize in this music the same spirit that had driven his own brother to leave their community? Or would he hear something else, not rebellion but remembrance? As the final notes faded, silence filled the workshop. No one spoke, understanding that words would only diminish what had just occurred. Eli lowered the violin, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The instrument had done more than survive its restoration. It had become a vessel for something precious and intangible. Sarah moved first, crossing the room to embrace her brother. In that gesture lay years of shared grief and mutual protection. Sir Anthony remained still, respecting the siblings' private moment while reflecting on how music could transcend the barriers of culture and custom. Hadn't Clara always said that true music came from the heart rather than the hands? The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. Soon the day's regular rhythms would resume. Chores would need attention, appearances would need maintaining, and the careful dance between tradition and truth would continue. But something had shifted in that dawn hour. Something as subtle yet significant as the difference between a merely repaired violin and one restored to its true voice. Jacob Miller quietly withdrew from his listening post, his mind already working on how this moment might open new possibilities for Eli's future. Sir Anthony gathered his thoughts, knowing that what had transpired would require careful navigation in the days ahead. And Sarah, ever watchful, began planning how to protect this fragile new reality. For Eli, holding the violin that now carried both his craftsmanship and his mother's memory, the path ahead seemed simultaneously clearer and more complex. How could he honor both his father's world and the music that seemed as essential as breathing? The answer lay somewhere in the spaces between notes, in the silences that gave meaning to the song. The violin returned to its case, but the melody lingered, weaving itself into the fabric of their shared story. What transformations would this morning's music set in motion? How would its echoes ripple through the careful boundaries between English and Amish, past and present, duty and desire? The violin's final note lingered in the barn's rafters, a haunting reminder of the mother's song that Eli had just performed. The silence that followed felt both sacred and terrifying, as if the world itself held its breath waiting for Eli Zook's response. Sir Anthony Hopkins stood in the shadows, his weathered hands clasped together, watching the scene unfold between father and son. Ezekiel remained motionless, his tall frame rigid against the wooden post where he had been standing throughout Eli's performance. The piece, crafted from memories of his late wife's favorite hymns, had stripped away years of carefully constructed walls. His fingers trembled against his beard, a subtle movement that only Sarah, standing nearby, seemed to notice. That tune, Ezekiel's voice cracked barely above a whisper. Where did you learn it? The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested, heavy with unspoken emotions that had been buried since his wife's passing. Eli lowered the violin, his fingers still wrapped around the instrument that Jacob Miller had helped him restore in secret. It came from here. He touched his chest, then gestured to the evening sky visible through the barn's window. From her, Sarah stepped forward, her dark dress rustling against the hay-strewn floor. She recognized the delicate moment unfolding before her, understanding that her brother's music had somehow reached past their father's stern exterior, to touch something long forgotten. Sir Anthony observed as Ezekiel's features softened, the usual hard lines around his mouth melting away. The older man had seen this transformation before, in countless audiences throughout his career, when music transcended mere sound to become a key that unlocked sealed chambers of the heart. She used to hum while working in the garden, Ezekiel said, his voice thick with memory. Every morning before the sun was fully up. He took a halting step toward his son, then another, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The moment carried echoes of Clara, Anthony's own late wife, and he felt her presence keenly. How many times had she insisted that music possessed healing properties beyond human understanding? The thought brought a sad smile to his face as he watched Ezekiel struggle with emotions he'd kept locked away for years. Your mother, Ezekiel, continued, now standing directly before Eli. She always said music was God's way of speaking when words failed. A single tear traced down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. I forgot that. I forgot so much. The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah moved closer to her father, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The touch seemed to break something loose within him, and more tears followed the first. Eli stood uncertain, the violin still in his hands, caught between the ingrained respect for his father's authority and the overwhelming urge to bridge the gap between them. The instrument that had caused so much conflict now served as a physical reminder of both division and potential healing. Sir Anthony thought of Jacob Miller, waiting in town, unaware of how his contribution to Eli's musical journey had helped catalyze this moment. The violin maker's craftsmanship had given voice to emotions too long silent in the Zook household. Play it again, Ezekiel requested, his voice rough with emotion. Please. The word seemed foreign on his lips, yet it marked a profound shift in the relationship between father and son. As Eli raised the violin once more, Sarah's eyes met Anthony's across the barn. They shared a look of understanding, both recognizing that the music had accomplished what years of words could not. The melody began again, but this time it carried new meaning, not just a tribute to a mother's memory, but a bridge between a father and son who had forgotten how to speak to each other's hearts. The notes rose and fell, weaving together strands of grief and love, loss and hope. Ezekiel closed his eyes, tears flowing freely now, as the music painted pictures of sunny mornings in the garden, of a woman's gentle humming, of a family once whole and perhaps, through these notes, whole again in a different way. The morning, after Ezekiel's emotional breakthrough, Anthony Hopkins sat in his workshop, methodically arranging a collection of violin-making tools. Each piece held memories of his own journey, from apprentice to master craftsman. How would these tools shape another young life, as they had once shaped his? The delicate carving knives, seasoned with decades of use, caught the early sunlight, streaming through the workshop windows. Anthony's weathered hands traced the worn handles, remembering Clara's gentle teasing about his obsession with keeping them perfectly sharp. She had understood, perhaps better than anyone, that these tools were more than mere instruments of craft. They were keys to unlocking dreams. Eli Zook appeared at his workshop door, her presence both expected and welcome. "I saw the light on," she said, stepping inside. "You're preparing them for Eli, aren't you?" Her intuitive understanding of his intentions didn't surprise Anthony anymore. In many ways, Sarah had become the bridge between two worlds, the traditional Amish life. She knew in the musical realm that had captured her brother's heart. "Your father's reaction yesterday," Anthony began, carefully wrapping a particularly fine gouge in soft leather. "It changes everything and nothing at the same time." He glanced at Sarah, noting how she nodded in agreement. Eli's path was always going to be unique. Now it might just be a little less lonely. Sarah moved closer to examine the tools, her fingers hovering over a beautifully preserved bow-making plane. "These tools tell stories, don't they? Each mark, each worn spot." Her question carried the weight of understanding that stretched beyond the physical implements before them. Anthony selected a small notebook from his desk, its pages filled with detailed sketches and measurements accumulated over decades. "Jacob Miller asked me once why I kept such meticulous notes when the measurements were all in my head." He opened the notebook, revealing diagrams of violin architecture that looked more like artistic renderings than technical drawings. I told him it wasn't about remembering, it was about passing on knowledge. The conversation shifted to practical matters as they discussed how to present these tools to Eli. Should they wait for the right moment, or would creating that moment themselves be more appropriate? Sarah's insights proved invaluable, her deep understanding of both her brother and their father helping to shape the plan. "There's something else," Anthony said, reaching beneath his workbench. He withdrew a small worn violin case that Sarah had never seen before. The leather was cracked with age, but the brass fittings still gleamed dully in the morning light. This belonged to Clara. She used it for teaching her youngest students. Inside lay not a full-sized violin, but a collection of partially completed violin pieces, a learning kit Clara had developed for teaching violin construction. Anthony's voice softened as he explained. She believed that understanding how to build something was just as important as knowing how to play it. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the educational value of such a gift. "This isn't just about the tools, is it? This is about giving Eli the foundation to build his own future." Her insight struck at the heart of Anthony's intentions. The morning progressed as they carefully cataloged each item, with Anthony sharing stories about particular tools and their significance. He included a letter, carefully written over several evenings, detailing not just technical instruction but the philosophy behind violin making, the patience required, the importance of listening to the wood, and the courage to trust one's instincts. As they worked, the conversation turned to the broader implications of their task. How would these tools, these tangible pieces of Anthony's life's work, help shape Eli's future? What doors would they open, and what challenges would they help him overcome? There's something powerful about passing on not just knowledge, but the means to create, Sarah observed, helping to arrange the tools in a specially crafted wooden case. "It's like giving someone a key to a door they didn't even know existed." Anthony paused in his work, considering her words. That's exactly what Clara would have said. He smiled, remembering his late wife's wisdom. She always understood that teaching wasn't about showing someone the path, it was about giving them the tools to find their own way. The morning light had strengthened into full day when they finally finished their preparations. The collection of tools, The learning kit and the carefully written instructions represented more than just physical objects. They embodied hope, possibility, and the continuation of a craft that bridged generations and cultures. What would Eli make of this inheritance? How would these tools, passed from one craftsman to another, shape not just his future but the future of violin making in this small corner of the world? The answers lay in the young hands that would soon hold these implements of creation, guided by the wisdom of those who had gone before. The autumn wind whispered through the cornfields as Eli Zook sat at his workbench, carefully examining the tools Anthony Hopkins had gifted him. Each piece represented more than its practical purpose. They were fragments of a dream he'd barely dared to acknowledge until now. How could such small objects carry the weight of so many possibilities? The creak of the barn door drew Eli's attention, but he didn't turn around. The heavy footsteps behind him could only belong to his father, Ezekiel. The air grew thick with unspoken words as Ezekiel's shadow fell across the workbench. Neither spoke for several long moments, the silence broken only by the distant sound of Sarah calling to the chickens. Ezekiel's weathered hand reached past Eli, picking up one of the finely crafted chisels. His fingers traced the worn wooden handle, telling stories of years of use and care. "These were well loved," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual stern edge. "Anthony Hopkins, he understands wood, yeah?" The question caught Eli off guard. His father had never before acknowledged Anthony's craftsmanship, let alone spoken his name without a trace of disdain. "Yes, Dad, he does." Eli watched as his father tested the chisel's edge with his thumb, noting how the older man's eyes softened at the tool's quality. Memories of Ezekiel's own brother, the one who had left their community to pursue music, seemed to hover in the air between them. How many times had similar tools caused discord in their family? Yet here was Ezekiel, handling these symbols of change with unexpected gentleness. Sarah appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a basket of eggs. She paused, sensing the delicate moment between father and son. Her presence added another layer to the complex web of family loyalties and understanding that had been slowly rewoven over the past months. What role had her quiet support played in softening their father's heart? "Jacob Miller spoke to me yesterday," Ezekiel said, setting down the chisel with careful precision. "He tells me there's need for someone who knows how to repair instruments." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Was this an offering of sorts, a compromise between tradition and talent? Eli's hands stilled over the tools. His father's words carried no judgment, no anger, only a simple statement of fact that somehow held worlds of meaning. Through the barn window he could see the spot where Anthony's car usually parked during their lessons. The empty space seemed less final now, less like an ending. The mention of Jacob Miller opened another door of possibility. The violin maker had long served as a bridge between their world and the English one, maintaining respect for both while helping music flow between them. Could he become a similar bridge for Eli? Ezekiel moved to the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. "Your mother's father, my father-in-law. He had hands like yours, always knowing just where the wood wanted to go." The comparison startled Eli. His grandfather had been highly respected in the community, known for his fine furniture and deep faith. Was his father offering more than just memories? Sarah set down her basket and approached them, her presence a balancing force. She had always understood both sides, the pull of tradition and the call of individual gifts. Her quiet strength had helped maintain peace in their family through all the recent changes. Now she stood witness to this subtle shift between father and son. "The tools," Ezekiel continued, "they need a proper cabinet." He gestured to the corner of the barn where old wood had been stored. "That maple there, it's been seasoning for 3 winters now." The offer was clear. Permission not just to keep the tools, but to honor them, to use them as they were meant to be used. Eli looked at his father. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing not just the stern patriarch, but a man who had faced his own struggles between duty and calling. What battles had Ezekiel fought within himself to reach this moment of quiet acceptance? The morning light strengthened, warming the barn's interior and illuminating the tools on the workbench. They gleamed with possibility, no longer symbols of division, but bridges between worlds. Sarah moved to stand between her father and brother, completing a circle of understanding that needed no words. In the distance, a violin sang out, probably young Mary Fisher practicing for Sunday services. The sound floated through the barn, reminding them all that music and craftsmanship had always been part of their world, woven into their community's fabric as surely as faith and family. Perhaps it wasn't about choosing between worlds after all, but about finding the harmony between them. The morning air carried a peculiar weight as Anthony Hopkins stood at the edge of the Zook property, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his leather suitcase. Behind him, the farmhouse stood silent against the awakening dawn, its windows reflecting the pale orange light like distant memories. How many mornings had he spent here, watching the interplay of shadow and light across these same fields? A gentle breeze stirred the tall grass, carrying with it the melodic calls of morning birds. Anthony closed his eyes, allowing the natural symphony to wash over him. Each note reminded him of Clara, of how she would wake early just to sit on their porch and identify each bird by its song. "Listen," she would say, "that's a wood thrush, nature's finest violinist." The memory brought an unexpected smile to his face. Sarah appeared beside him, her presence as quiet as the morning itself. "The birds seem especially vocal today," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps they're saying goodbye." She handed Anthony a small wrapped package, the brown paper carefully folded around what he knew must be some of her fresh-baked bread. Their shared silence spoke volumes about the changes the past months had brought. Sarah had become more than just Eli's protective sister. She had emerged as a bridge between two worlds, understanding both the pull of tradition and the call of something new. "Will you watch over him?" Anthony asked, though he already knew the answer. From the barn came the faint sound of violin strings being tuned, Eli's morning ritual now as natural as the rooster's cry. The notes drifted across the farmyard, mingling with the birdsong in an impromptu duet. Anthony recognized the piece, Bach's Partita in D minor, the same piece Clara had loved to play on piano while he accompanied her on violin. Jacob Miller's truck appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind it like a golden ribbon in the morning light. He had offered to drive Anthony to the train station, a final act of friendship between two men who had found common ground in their love of music and their concern for a young Amish violinist's future. Ezekiel emerged from the house, his stern figure softened somehow by the early light. The tension that had characterized their earlier encounters had transformed into something resembling respect, or perhaps resignation. Their eyes met briefly across the yard, and Ezekiel gave a slight nod, acknowledgement of what had passed between them, of what would continue even after Anthony's departure. The violin music from the barn shifted to a different melody, one Anthony didn't recognize immediately. Then it struck him. It was Eli's own composition, the one he'd been working on in secret. The notes spoke of both longing and belonging, of roots growing alongside wings. How fitting that this should be Anthony's farewell serenade. Sarah touched his arm gently. "He won't come out to say goodbye?" she said softly. "It would be too much." Anthony nodded, understanding. Some partings were better left unspoken, their meaning carried instead by the music that connected them. As Jacob's truck pulled up, the morning chorus reached a crescendo. A mockingbird took up position on the fence post, its varied calls echoing across the farm. Clara had always said that mockingbirds were nature's greatest teachers, learning and incorporating new songs throughout their lives. The bird's performance seemed to weave together all the separate threads of music floating through the morning air. Eli's violin, the other bird's songs, even the distant echo of Clara's piano. Anthony picked up his suitcase, its weight nothing, compared to the memories he would carry with him. The sun had fully cleared the horizon now, painting the world in shades of possibility. As he walked toward Jacob's truck, the violin music from the barn grew softer, but didn't cease. It followed him, intertwining with the birdsong, creating a farewell symphony that spoke of endings and beginnings, of lessons taught and learned, of music that transcended the boundaries between worlds. The truck door closed with a soft click, and as Jacob put the vehicle in gear, Anthony caught one final glimpse of the farm through the swirling morning mist. The music, both natural and human-made, continued to fill the air, reminding him of Clara's words about how every goodbye contains the seed of a future hello. Perhaps she had been right about that, as she had been right about so many things. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.